January was especially harsh that year. The thermometer hadn't risen above minus 22 Fahrenheit for 2 weeks straight, but the experienced truck driver Mark Jensen had no idea that this brutal cold would lead him to a meeting that would forever change his lonely life. This 42-year-old giant, standing 6'3" with broad shoulders and a thick chestnut beard, had been driving along the most dangerous northern routes for the past 15 years, delivering supplies to remote settlements after the tragic loss of his wife in a car accident 5 years ago. He found solace on endless roads where only the roar of the engine and the whisper of the wind kept him company. That fateful night before his trip, Mark couldn't sleep, haunted by a strange feeling. The silence in the roadside motel felt unnatural. He had never seen his fellow drivers like this. Usually noisy and restless, the truckers sat in corners, quietly staring into the darkness outside the windows as if waiting for something inevitable. The wind howled like a wolf, scratching the window with branches as if trying to warn them of some danger. Mark checked the weather forecast 3 times. It promised a severe snowstorm, but the urgent shipment of medicine to a remote village had to be delivered by the next morning. People's lives depended on it. At such moments, Mark felt the importance of his job especially sharply. While others slept in warm houses, he paved the way through the snow desert, connecting towns with welcome to Spa Stories, where the line between the known and the unknown fades, and the shadows whisper truths untold. Tonight, we delve into the primal connection between humans and animals, a bond forged in trust, sometimes fear, and always in mystery, an invisible threat of civilization. On the frosty morning when the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of pearl and lavender, Mark started up his trusty truck. The powerful machine responded with a low rumble like a huge beast waking from sleep. The thermometer in the cabin showed minus 34 F, and the radio warned of an approaching blizzard. The road ahead wound through dense forest where the signal often cut out, and he could count the passing cars on one hand. The first hour of the journey was tough. The road had turned to ice, and visibility dropped to a minimum due to the starting snowstorm. Mark's partner, an experienced driver named Jim, was supposed to follow an hour later, but he had already lost signal, so he couldn't confirm if Jim had left at all. The massive wheels slowly but confidently carved a path through the snowy wasteland. Mark kept glancing at the temperature and pressure gauges. In such cold, any technical failure could be fatal. The heater was working, looking at full capacity, but the windows still tried to cover themselves with frost patterns around the edges. Suddenly he noticed the first tracks in the snow, large wolf paw prints zigzagging across the road as if the animals were searching for something. 5 minutes later, more tracks appeared, coming from both sides of the road as if an invisible pack was escorting the truck. Mark couldn't help but recall the stories of old truck drivers about wolves that follow trucks waiting for a breakdown. 5 minutes later, something incredible happened. From behind a sharp turn, a huge white wolf stepped onto the road. In the truck's headlights, its first shone like freshly fallen snow, and its eyes glowed with an almost supernatural amber light. It was much larger than regular wolves, a true giant whose head seemed to reach the side mirrors of the truck. An old scar marked its face, giving the beast an especially majestic look. Mark could have kept driving, but something in the wolf's confident movements made him press the brakes. The heavy truck came to a slow halt, releasing clouds of steam from the exhaust pipes in the cabin. The strained howl of the wind could be heard, flinging bursts of snow at the windshield. Mark's hand reached for the emergency light, but he stopped halfway into it and told him not to make any sudden movements. In a matter of seconds, the truck was surrounded by a pack. About 15 wolves emerged from the snowy haze like ghosts. Their breath turned into white clouds of steam, and their eyes reflected the headlights, creating a spooky dance of lights in the darkness. All the predators bore the marks of a brutal winter, ribs showing through dull coats and movements filled with deep exhaustion. One wolf held its back paw out, clearly injured, but still stayed with the pack. A young she-wolf with a silver undercoat was limping, her side covered with dried blood, perhaps from a fight with a boar or a moose. This winter had broken all records. of harshness. The old-timers said that such a cold winter hadn't been seen in half a century. The deep snow made hunting nearly impossible. Hoofed animals had moved to better feeding grounds. Small game hid away, and hunger drove the wolves closer to human habitation, forcing them to risk their lives for a morsel of food. The white alpha wolf moved with a particular grace despite his exhaustion. His behavior seemed almost human. He methodically circled the true, sniffing the tires in the cabin. Mark noticed that part of his left ear was missing, an old battle scar likely from a fight for pack leadership. The wolf stopped directly in front of the radiator, lifted his head, and locked eyes with Mark. In those amber eyes was something more than animal intelligence. It was as if ancient wisdom was looking straight into the soul of a human. Mark felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear but from the realization that he was witnessing something incredible. In 15 years on the road he had seen many strange things, but this was something special. Suddenly the alpha emitted a low growl, and the pack parted, forming a living corridor toward the forest. Moments later, a gray she-wolf emerged from the darkness, gently carrying a small light-colored bundle in her mouth. Mark held his breath. It was a wolf cub, very young, no more than a month old. His fur still fluffy like a baby's, was a unique silvery white, almost like the alpha's. The she-wolf, apparently the cub's mother, was in the worst condition of the entire pack. Her ribs protruded so much they looked like they might pierce her skin, and her eyes were hollow with hunger. Still, she held herself with surprising dignity, carefully carrying her precious burden. Approaching the cabin, she gently laid the cub on the packed snow and stepped back a few paces. The alpha approached the cub and touched it tenderly with his nose, as if saying goodbye. Then he looked up at Mark, and in that moment Mark understood everything without words. This wasn't a threat or an attack. It was a plea for help. The pack, cornered by the merciless winter, had come to the men not as an enemy but as a last hope to save their most precious, their young. Mark's heart ached from the trust placed in him. He remembered his own loss, the emptiness after his wife's death, the lonely nights on the road. Maybe this was a sign of fate, a chance to save a life when he couldn't save the one he loved most. Slowly making sure not to move, suddenly he opened the cabin door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and the wolf pack. Mark slowly stepped down the steps, his boots sinking into the deep snow. The wolves tensed but didn't move. They seemed to understand the importance of the moment. The alpha stood motionless, only his tail twitching slightly from tension. Every step toward the cub was difficult for Mark, not because of the snow but because of the weight of responsibility. The cub lay curled up in a small trembling ball on the snow as Mark bent down to pick it up. The cub opened its eyes. They were an amazing golden color, like the alpha's. Despite the cold and exhaustion, there was a spark of life in them. The trucker's hands, used to the heavy steering wheel, wrapped around the tiny body with surprising tenderness. The cub was incredibly light, clearly undernourished, with ribs palpable even through the thick fur. It didn't resist, only whimpered quietly and pressed against the warmth of Mark's jacket. At that moment, the cub's mother let out a long, mournful howl. It echoed through the snowy forest, aching in Mark's heart. The other wolves joined her song. It was not a threat but a farewell lament for the cub they had to give up to save. Mark felt a single tear roll down his cheek, freezing instantly in the cold. The owl came close, so close that Mark could see the gray hairs around his muzzle. Speaking of his venerable age, the wolf rose on his hind legs, placing his front paws on the man's jacket, and gently touched the cub's cheek with his nose. This gesture was filled with such tenderness and sorrow that Mark held his breath. Then the alpha lowered himself back into the snow and let out a short, commanding growl. At this signal, the pack began to slowly retreat into the forest. They left one by one, disappearing into the snowstorm like ghosts. The last to leave were the alpha and the cub's mother. She looked back several times, as if remembering the place where she left her baby. Mark stood still, clutching his precious burden to his chest until the last gray silhouette disappeared among the trees. Returning to the cabin, he first turned on the extra heater and took a thermos of hot broth from his bag. He carefully dripped a few drops into the cub's slightly open mouth. It greedily swallowed the enerving liquid and wagged its tiny tail for the first time. I'll call you Nord, Mark whispered after. The north wind that brought you to me. The rest of the journey they made. Together the little cub slept curled up on the passenger seat wrapped in Mark's warm jacket somewhere deep in the forest. His former pack continued their journey, fighting for survival in this harsh winter, but for Nord a new life was beginning, a life under the protection of a man to whom the wild and proud animals had entrusted their most precious. The snowstorm gradually died down and the first stars appeared through the breaks. In the clouds ahead lay a long road full of challenges and surprises, but Mark knew he had made the right choice in his heart, frozen by years of loneliness. The first ice was starting to melt and the little cub whimpered quietly in his sleep, perhaps saying goodbye to his old life or greeting his new one. In the 2 years since that day, Nord grew into a magnificent wolf with silver fur and golden eyes. The scars on his body healed, leaving barely noticeable lines under the thick coat. Mark converted part of his property into a spacious enclosure, but Nord mostly slept in the house by his owner's bed like a loyal dog. The local residents were initially wary of the wild animal, but gradually grew accustomed to the unusual pair. Mark continued working as a truck driver, but now chose shorter routes so as not to leave Nord alone for long in his absence. A neighbor, Anna, an elderly former veterinarian, cared for the wolf with a deep affection for the unusual pet. Sometimes on winter nights when the blizzard howls especially mournfully, Nord raises his head to the sky and lets out a long howl. At these moments, Mark sits beside him on the porch, wrapping an arm around his powerful neck, and together they gaze into the darkness of the forest. Perhaps somewhere out there, among the snow-covered pines, the very pack with the white leader still roams. Or maybe it's just a call of blood, reminding Nord of his wild roots. But each time after these moments of nostalgia, the wolf returns to the house, following his men, snuggles against his legs and whimpers contentedly as if to say, "This is my home, this is my new pack." And Mark, looking into his golden eyes, understands that miracles happen even in the darkest times, and sometimes by saving a life you save your own soul. Now, when Mark drives along that same road where they met, he always slows down and peers into the depths of the forest. And though no one has seen the white wolf, since truckers say that in particularly harsh winters giant wolf tracks can be seen crossing that road as if someone invisible is still guarding the path that brought together two such different fates in one amazing story. Remember, the next time you hear the rustle of leaves or feel unseen eyes watching, it could be more than just your imagination.